Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. We've had some incredible historians on the channel to talk about the Eastern Front. David Starr, Prit Buttar, Adam Tooze, and Wendy Goldman, to name just four. Well, today, I'm delighted to talk to author and broadcaster Jonthan Dimbleby about his latest book, Endgame. Here's my copy there. You can find links to purchase it in the description below, or you can buy it at your favorite bookstore or borrow it at your local library. But I'll bring him in now. Good morning, Jonathan. How are you today?
Paul, I'm well. I did actually spend rather too much time watching the election last night.
Didn't we all?
I am still alive and not exactly unwell.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you here. So we were just chatting before going live. I mean, the Eastern Front, Bagration, the June to May 1945, it's a colossal amount of things happening. And when you tackled some, I mean, obviously you've done Barbarossa. I think when you do podcasts and you speak to people about the Eastern Front, do you think people are still surprised by just how large the area is that the Soviet army is fighting over? Because, we tend to look from things from that kind of Normandy beachhead of 70 miles across, and the Eastern Front is massive. Is it daunting when you face a subject like that to try and write about it?
It is, because in order to understand Bagration itself, you have to go back further. You have to go back to the entire front from the end of 1943, beginning of 1944, which was a front of 2,500, 3,000 kilometers. I mean, it wiggled along in various ways from the Baltic to the Balkans. And it involved huge numbers of people. It involved 6.5 million roughly on the Soviet side, and about 2.5 on the German side. Massively outnumbered the Germans were along this huge front, and there were a great number of operations. At the beginning of the year, there were 10 operations in what was then called the Ukraine. Slow, painstaking, churning through the mud, through terrible weather, as the Soviets advanced into Ukraine. At the same time, in the north, you had the liberation of Leningrad. And in the center, which is where Bagration took place, you had a sort of an attritional front where nothing much was happening until you reached June of 1944. So it's a huge front, very complicated. And the challenge for the author who wants to make it clear, make it vivid, drive a narrative forward, not oversimplifying, you have to go through put all the materials through a great controversial sieve. And to come back to where you started, yes, most people that I spoke to before I started the book had no idea what Bagration was. And it seemed to me to be important to establish its importance in winning the Second World War.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the things we're burdened with the Eastern Front is we label the battles by the cities. You mentioned yourself Leningrad and Stalingrad, and we don't in the West really use the term front, which kind of means different things to us than it does to the East. And I think also that we sometimes tend to overlook that between Barbarossa, which of course he wrote about in the past, and Bagration, there's 3 years. There's 3 years of stuff happening. And it's not like there's a single moment where the Germans are on the brink of victory and then suddenly the next day they woke up, they're on the brink of defeat. It's a constantly changing, fluid situation. And the Germans are actually damn good in that kind of year before Bagration in just causing attritional casualties and holding the line. And I think addressing that 3 years, when the question I'm going to ask you is, where do you start the Bagration story? Do you start it at the beginning of Barbarossa, or do you start it kind of, as you said there, at the beginning of 44?
Well, I actually in the book I take us from Moscow 1941. Which was that was the point at which, as I tried to identify in that book, that was the point at which it was unequivocally clear that Hitler could not beat the Soviet Union. He carried on, as you say, in an attritional conflict, took them to Stalingrad, gradual retreat from Stalingrad after the most appalling bloodletting, resisted in 1943 and counterattacked most notoriously or famously at the biggest, said to be, there's some debate about this, a huge tank battle at Kharkov. And then, but it was always slowly retreating. But of course, Hitler never acknowledging that the retreat, he acknowledged there was a retreat, let alone tactical retreat, whereas if generals wanted a much broader strategic retreat, has some hope of preventing the Red Army taking Germany. So that whole period was warfare. You were light on it, I think, correctly. It's very dangerous to see particular moments as turning points. It's not, on the whole, a series of turning points. Yes, there are battles that have after a fierce struggle, lead to a breakthrough of one kind or another. But to see it as turning points, it's sort of oddly ahistorical. The process is what matters. So I start the book, as I say, summarize through 1940-43. We're talking 42-43, and then pick up. And at the end of 1943, and in political terms, I bookend the book, if I can put it like that. Well, it doesn't quite, it's not in this order, but crudely, politically, between the two great conferences, one at the end of 1943, the other early in 1944, which settled the political, geographical, diplomatic contest, which was essentially then between the Soviet Union and the West.
Well, thank you for bringing up the fact that the political side of things is very important as well, and that diplomatic, but also the ideology. I mean, you cannot separate Barbarossa from the German or the Third Reich's intentions and their frankly terrible intentions. But by 44, you just mentioned Hitler there, clearly at that level, but even at the kind of core commander level on the German side, are they still underestimating the Red Army? I mean, is there still a sense that they're fighting a weaker foe? And if so, is that based on military assessment, or is it based on kind of ideological principles?
Well, these are good separate issues. There was a prevailing view still, certainly amongst the rank and file of the German soldiers on the Eastern Front, the Ostia, that somehow, because Hitler was demigod, that they would prevail, and therefore they would follow him, which is why they did not resist this ludicrous idea of Hitler establishing some 28 Festerplätze, 45 places, which were basically cities, to hold the line. So to put up these fortifications, weak as they were, would somehow stop the advance. However, the commanders and the best of them increasingly knew that the game was up unless they retreated wholesale and strategically way back from the front. Because in the beginning of 1944, the Germans were still in partial occupation of Soviet territory. So there's a long way to go to drive them out of Soviet territory and then to establish, from Stalin's point of view, a great buffer zone, and also to be in a hugely powerful position to dictate the fate of Europe.
No, thank you very much. And bring it back to Bagration. It's hard even when you're looking at the maps. They just a concentration of arrows running kind of towards the west from the north down to the south there, to kind of get a sense of it, because maps tend to be, showing one moment in time. They can't show that progression. In trying to explain that advance, because it is, from June 44 to V-Day, it's, 11 months. It doesn't move at a kind of a steady pace. There's kind of, it starts a bit slow, then it has that piercing bit where it looks like it's going to be really quite dynamic, and then as it gets closer to Germany kind of slows down again, and the Germans begin to fight like that kind of the wounded tiger analogy even more fiercely. How difficult is it to convey, again, that sort of ebb and flow of a battle when you're trying to also bring in the political aspect? And again, we're talking about such a massive, great front, that sense that the advanced West is not trundling at a steady pace. It's having its peaks and troughs, so to speak.
That's absolutely right. I mean, while the Western Allies were fighting bloodily and slowly through France, through Normandy, to France, on to liberate Paris and on eastwards, the Soviets were going in fits and starts. And that was for a number of reasons, one of which was simply logistical. I mean, their supply lines were longer and longer the further west they went, and the more and more demanding they were, therefore, of fuel, supplies, food, weapons, ammunition, and so forth. At the same time, the Germans fought bitterly. You touched on it. They fought increasingly bitterly because they were ordinary soldiers supplied to, and with some good reason, after the horrific crimes that had been committed on Soviet soil. Remember the millions upon millions of ordinary civilians who had been slaughtered by the Nazis, leave aside the 6 million Jews who were being obliterated in that time. The hatred of the Soviets, of the Soviet soldiers for the Germans was intense. There was nothing like it on the Western Front. And the increasing sense of desperation on the German side meant that they fought hard. And all the way through the war on the Eastern Front, you had this initial sense of the Germans that they would walk their way, a view shared in the West, incidentally, in 1941, that they would carve through the Red Army like knife through a butter. And then gradually that became more and more difficult, in fact impossible. They couldn't do it. So they retreated hard. The physical conditions were important. They were quite difficult. In some places, the Germans did have strong fortifications, although they were massively outnumbered in every relevant respect. You have to remember too that the Russians, the Soviet armies on the fronts, their army groups, and touched on it, their army groups, 10 of them all along from north to south, were called fronts. Rather confusing when you also have a front line, which is called front. I go for capital letters, even if it shouldn't be, for fronts when it's the army group, and small f when it's the normal front line. The Soviet forces got tired. I mean, they were tired. These advances across difficult terrain being resisted meant that they were easily drained, and this came sharply in focus when you get after Bagration. But the breakthrough, there was fierce fighting it was launched on June June the 22nd, which happened to coincide with 3 years earlier with the launch of Barbarossa. But that was happenstance rather than design. And once they broke through fantastically rapidly through the 5 fronts along the Belarusian border, the Belarusian balcony, it was called, from Vitebsk in the north down to Bobruisk in the south, which is a 700-kilometer front, incidentally. And the fighting was very intense around these 5 principal fortified cities. But once they'd got through those, which took only, in some cases, only a couple of days, they advanced at great speed westwards, and then paused to regroup. They had to, because they'd advanced hundreds of kilometers in the matter of weeks. And the whole of Bagration was the heart of Bagration, the breaking of the back of the Wehrmacht, really took place by early July. I mean, 2 weeks after launching the battle, by early mid-July, they had managed to capture something in the order of 25 divisions, more than 350,000 men, who were then carted off eastwards, those who had survived, some of them to be show-marched through the streets of Moscow to demonstrate the great patriotic war victory. Excuse me. That advance drained. It's easy to forget how. I mean, the turning over of personnel, because people going back from the front and up to the front in order to be refreshed, we're familiar with today, but there wasn't much chance for that because of the speed of advance. And it was very rough fighting. I mean, I've got a lot in the book, extraordinary material, which we came across, a wonderful researcher who came across it for me, Russian researcher, of the idea that this was some kind of glorious flag-waving advance, all guns blazing. It wasn't like that. It was fierce fighting, and the retreat was of the Germans was bitterly fought, and much to the frustration of some of the generals, as I said, and the extent to which, by the time they'd got beyond the Belarusian border into Poland, you're now talking about advances of hundreds of kilometers, many hundreds of kilometers. It slowed, and then it advanced again until they got to the Vistula. And the other thing that holds things up on the way there are all the rivers, because the rivers are difficult to cross. You've got narrow bridges. You've got pack horse bridges, which is not much good for T-36 tanks. And you have to fight for every bit of land. Sometimes the Germans broke and ran, and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they rounded up and offered themselves for surrender, and sometimes under those circumstances they were shot. Very occasionally, incidentally, as we know, that happened on the Western Front as well. So this was anything but a smooth journey. If I can just give you one extraordinary, to me, statistic. At the beginning of Barbarossa in 1941 in June, the Russians had, the Soviets had 6.25 million soldiers on the front line, across the front line. Between then and 1944, beginning of 1944, they lost 7.5 million soldiers. Yet, by that point, they also still had on the front line 6.5 million soldiers. So they were able to make good their losses as a result of the huge disproportionate number of men they could call upon from varying qualities, varying degrees of training. And they had this great urge to break the Germans. The ordinary soldiers had this great urge to break the Germans. They also knew that they had pretty limited options, the Soviets. If the Germans fought back and they were, for instance, encircled, they had essentially three choices. One, they surrender. And if they surrender, which is what would happen in any normal, I put normal in inverted commas, any Western army under those circumstances would surrender, because otherwise it's just, it's death for what purpose, or imprisonment. In the Soviet case, if they surrendered, their families were treated as though they were traitors back in Russia. It was a criminal offense to surrender. If they allowed themselves to be taken prisoner, even if they had not surrendered, they faced the death that actually happened to more than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war in German hands. Third option was to just retreat, in which case they had so-called blocking battalions, that Stalin did, which were there to mow down those who opted to retreat. So you fought and you died. And if you didn't die, you were fortunate. Once, of course, you were surrounded. You managed to escape, break out, or something like that. So the overall point of my book, if I can put it, is it's not in any way to diminish the extraordinary achievement of D-Day and the battle for Normandy and thereafter. It was very, very important, but it was not critical to breaking the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht was broken on the Eastern Front. Moreover, although as a result of our achievements, the West, as it were, Western Europe was broadly saved for democracy, the Eastern Front fell into Soviet hands, with everything that implied for the future and for the Cold War. And we I think, because of our understandable focus on what, as it were, our boys, in American terms, did in Europe following D-Day, and it is important and fascinating, we have tended to overlook the fact that what happened on the Eastern Front was actually a far greater historic significance.
Yeah, well, it begins a new era as well as completing one, whereas the Western Front doesn't really start a new era. It does just end one. But I want to bring you back to what you said about the the post-war period, the Cold War, because we've done a lot about the conferences on this channel, and we talked about with Michael Nyberg and others about Casablanca, for example, which people tend to admit was the British victory because Americans went in underprepared to negotiate, and the British kind of came out on top with a decent package. By the time you get to someone like Yalta, that's probably Stalin's victory, isn't it? He probably takes it. So what?
You have to go back, Paul. You have to go back. Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem.
You have to go back to Tehran. Tehran's decisive conference in the end of November, December 1943, the first meeting of the Big Three, the meeting after which, when Churchill was reflecting on it, he said tellingly, for the first time I realized just how small Britain was. There I was, sitting on my right hand, the great American bison, on my left hand, its paws stretched out, the great Russian bear, in the middle, the little English donkey. So, and it said a lot about Churchill. He had the kind of chagrin, wistfulness, and honesty to say that. That was where, in terms, without any formal agreement, the future of Europe, by which time it was quite clear to Roosevelt, who wasn't concerned about this, and Churchill, who was concerned about it, the future of Europe was mapped out. That was then at Yalta confirmed. It was a sort of legal codicil. And oddly, everyone except for a few at Yalta thought it was a great triumph because they'd allowed themselves a degree of wishful thinking. Churchill had not. Churchill, before D-Day, was talking, was saying, I've got the quote somewhere or other, but it doesn't matter, was saying to Eden, are you not aware that a great tide of evil is flowing across the continent? Roosevelt didn't see it like that. He was going to forge a partnership with the man he was delighted to call Uncle Joe. That difference of perspective was reflected in a very different approach to how the war should be ended on the East and Western front, because the British were determined that we should advance as rapidly as possible, as it were, on the Nazi head decapitated in Berlin. The Americans were quite happy to go round the side to meet up and join hands with the Russians. But the outturn was that Stalin, a mixture of charm, thuggery, skill, massive attention to detail, was able to get more or less what he wanted, because it was impossible, even had they wanted, it was impossible, as was pointed out to Churchill soon after VE Day by his chiefs of staff. It was impossible to confront militarily the Soviets. I mean, Roosevelt, when the Poles early on, way before the Russians had moved into Poland, and at the point at which they were negotiating the new borders of Poland at Tehran secretly, Roosevelt said to the Polish ambassador in Moscow, in Washington, said, "You don't really think we're going to go to war against the Russians for Poland, do you, over a bit of land?" That was the American attitude, because they looked at it from afar. It was in many ways a faraway problem. For Churchill and for Europe, it was a huge issue.
Do you think that the FDR and Churchill were a little bit too focused on that agreement they had, that the Germans, the unconditional surrender was the only option? Because when you go back to the Mediterranean, the British and American aspirations for empire and lack of not of empire had been very not in agreement, not in alignment, and then they kind of found that common ground, and torch worked okay, and so. But by 44, they're holding on to this thing that this single thing. There are other things they agree on, but the unconditional surrender is one of the real uniting factors between the Americans and the Brits. Their focus on that, you kind of make this point in your book, is that allowing them to not so much ignore, as you made clear a minute ago, they're not ignoring what's going to happen with Stalin, but it's maybe just dismissing it or not focusing enough? Was there anything that the British and American could have done to have head off what Stalin was planning? Was everything that happened just always going to happen?
Very good question. At Casablanca, where the unconditional surrender demand was made, the British and Churchill, but the British did not like the idea of an unconditional surrender because they foresaw that it would not allow any wriggle room, as it were, in dealing with what would be a defeated enemy. It was Roosevelt who was absolutist about this. There had to be unconditional surrender. And that did significantly, I think, distort the focus. But that which did not, however, mean that there was anything the West could have done about it, because the military force, boots on the ground, was in Stalin's purview. He had the ground. He was advancing eastwards. It was touch on it. It's only a footnote in the book. It's a footnote in history. It's quite a pertinent one. That soon after V-Day, about 7 days after V-Day, he got in touch, Churchill, with chiefs of staff and asked, "Could you tell me whether or not we could have an immediate, early surprise attack on the Soviet troops in Germany?" Remember, this was only a few days after Churchill had been in the Mall, Ministry of Defense, waving at the vast, joyful crowds below and saluting the achievements of the Soviet Union. Simultaneously, it was in his mind, could we not go to war against the Soviets? And the chiefs of staff, it was called, I don't know whether it was called this in irony or whether it was actually kind of, let's think the unthinkable, but it was called Operation Unthinkable.
Yeah.
And they came back and said, you could conceivably approach it. It would require the entire, open brackets, exhausted Western armies, Americans and the British, the remnants of the Wehrmacht, who were supportive, and the Commonwealth forces, and it would be a long struggle, and the outcome would be uncertain, but you could try it. And of course, it was not something that Churchill ever put to the Americans, who would have rejected it out of hand, because they at that point wanted to get out of Europe as fast.
Yeah. I remember speaking to my granddad, who did 6 years away in the British Army, and it came up when I was a teenager about the potential of invading Soviet Union. I think it's the only time my granddad swore. He said, "Well, I'd have told him to fuck off." He said to Churchill, he just felt he had done enough, regardless of any potential merit. I just would have said no. I wanted to go home.
I think that must have been a hugely widespread.
Yeah, I think so.
It was obviously crazy. What is interesting is it's a measure of Churchill's antipathy, fear, and horror at the prospect of Soviet control of Eastern Europe, and also his, he felt very powerfully about Poland, and the failure and the inability to come to Poland's rescue hit him hard and deeply. And I don't think he ever forgot it. A lot of Poles, for understandable reasons, still regard, when I say a lot, significant number of Poles. I haven't had many people kicking back on my analysis of why neither the Stalin nor the West could come to the rescue of the Poles, and the horror of what happened in August of 1944, the uprising. Some regard Churchill as sort of letting them go, that for raison d'etat, for bigger strategic reasons. I don't think that's fair. We could do nothing militarily, and the strategic interests of the Soviet Union meant that they would not assault Warsaw head on. And this is a very, very critical moment. And you want to go back right earlier, what you were talking about, the advance. Had they tried to take Warsaw, a large city, very carefully across the Vistula River, with tired troops, with the Nazis reinforcing with panzers the city, to go into street by street fighting against the Nazis determined to hold on to Warsaw, albeit to destroy the Polish people in the process, because that's what they wished to do. It was a non-starter. It would have been strategically daft, because they had a bigger objective, which which was to get through Poland and to break the Wehrmacht in Germany itself.
Thank you. So I want to bring it back to the time scale from June 44 to May 45, because in the West, people have used to say that the Normandy campaign was slow and ponderous. Then some historians actually know it was quite fast. It came in under Montgomery's, schedule, and then the push to eventually to across Belgium and Netherlands, and then we now go to the east and the movement there. That 11 months to push the Germans back and defeat them, do you perceive it as being something that the Red Army could have done faster? Were they slow? Was it about what was to be expected? Did the Western Allies think that the Soviets did it faster than they would? I mean, what's your sort of take on the speed of that movement?
Well, they did cover a vast amount of territory. It was about 1,500 kilometers, as it were, from their start line that they covered. I think my own view is it would have been extraordinarily difficult to do it faster without allowing the Germans to regroup on one front.
Right.
So they went forward. It was very carefully planned. They went forward, holding the center. Much easier in the north because Leningrad was much easier. The relief of Leningrad was easier to accomplish. Pretty miserable conditions and a horror that they uncovered. In the south, in Ukraine, I mean, you get a sense today how difficult it is to fight in the Ukraine in any case. Well, that was slow going. And in the south, then, Hitler was absolutely certain that all the advance, he discounted Bagration, which is part of his problem. He was directing forces to the south to protect Ukraine against the summer offensive. So the Ukrainian offensives, which were themselves were, in 1,200 kilometers in the space of 3 months, is not bad going from Kiev as it was, through to the point that they reached when they halted that offensive. They were also going down, don't forget, into Crimea, liberating Crimea. So I think they were mopping up all the way. So I don't think that they could have gone faster, any more than I think that the Western Allies could actually have gone faster than they did. I think it's an odd, I think it's because we go back to the image of the panzers racing across the Soviet Union when they did their well, Soviets should have been ready but weren't. That was a conscious decision by Stalin to unready them. Raced across to Smolensk in the first day or two of the first week of the invasion. I think we look at the swirl of tanks and the dust behind them. I think it was, why couldn't it have been faster? I don't think it could have been. I think it was faster than it would have been as a result of in part a result of the Lend-Lease, which provided Chevrolets and Studebaker six-wheelers that had four-wheel drive and were able to cover ground. You remember that the Germans came in at Barbarossa. They came in with 700,000 horses to bear equipment and to carry guns. And even by 1944, when there was much more mechanization, but not as much as the Soviets had already achieved, the Soviets were still advancing with a number of their troops on what they call panji wagons, these carts, horse-drawn carts, as well as very much faster on the Studebakers by comparison with what the Germans were able to achieve, because they didn't have so much mechanized infantry, and so that the Russians had much less of a problem in 44 with the tanks getting a long way in front of the infantry, because the infantry couldn't keep up, which is one of the problems that there was for the Germans in Barbarossa. The tanks drove on, the panzers drove on, and the infantry, poor bloody infantry, panting behind, trying to keep up in the heat of the summer. So I think that it could even have been slower than it was. I think that the presence of Lend-Lease actually accelerated. My own view is that Lend-Lease didn't determine the outcome of the Second World War. A massive exaggeration. It hastened the outcomes, hastened the defeat of the Wehrmacht.
So Thank you very much for that. With analysing Bagration or indeed Barbarossa, we're in 2024. It's so easy. Just we want to put labels on things. This commander was brilliant. This commander was hopeless. This tank was great. This tank was appalling. Because there's this sort of paradox with the Red Army in that they are getting better in 44 at combined arms and use of artillery and moving things forward. And as you said, they're more mechanized than they had been. They're quite mobile, and yet you can't get away from the fact they're incurring horrendous losses. Even though they, as you said, they start out outnumbering the Germans roughly 3-1, and yet they're incurring 700,000 or something killed or something. So how do you balance this? How do you rate them? It's very complicated to kind of put a figure and say, the Soviet army is performing at 7 out of 10. It's very difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think one way, it's a very crude way of looking at it, is that it's a measure of how bitterly the Germans fought. That German losses, which had been much lower than Soviet losses before 44, in 44. The German losses were increasing at a much faster rate than the Soviet losses, which meant that the Germans were getting relatively even weaker. And I think it's worth saying too. I mean, I think there were whereas Hitler was kind of trying to block all the holes on the front by moving panzer divisions here and there, infantry divisions there, sacking generals, just as Stalin had been in 1941, very similarly. Now, Stalin was confident. It's important to note neither Hitler nor Stalin gave a toss about human life. The democratic army would never have been required to, and probably would never have done what was required of the Soviet or the German armies. It just could not have been. It would not have been possible. And I think it's important that we realize that the Soviet commanders that were in place by 1944, Zhukov, Konev, Rokossovsky, Bagration, Malinovsky, they were battle-hardened commanders who, on the whole, Stalin trusted. And Stavka, the high command in Moscow, had elaborated, it was a long-standing concept, had elaborated the practice of Maskirovka, deception, on a scale. You remember Operation Fortitude on the Western Front, which deceived the Germans into thinking that D-Day might be launched against Calais, Pas de Calais. Maskirovka was on a hugely greater scale and even greater complexity. So entire divisions were sent overnight to different parts of the front, while allowing the Germans to believe that they hadn't moved at all, or indeed that on one part of the front, which was being divested of its troops, was actually being increased. So the Germans were bamboozled the whole time. Their intelligence could not keep up with the speed and cleverness of that planning. And that was all. Maskirovka was built into every planned operation, and that planning was very careful. Bagration was detailed planning in April. It involved certainly quite fierce confrontations, not least directly between Rokossovsky and who played the key role in Bagration, Rokossovsky and Stalin. And Rokossovsky point blank said, "I won't do what you want," and himself, having been a victim of the purges in 1938, tortured, imprisoned, and threatened with execution, but refused to confess to a crime that he hadn't committed, suddenly is released again to the front, and becomes someone who will not do, however, what he thinks is wrong to do, and is prepared to take the consequences. And I think, as it happens, he's a very great general. And he stood up to Stalin, and all Stalin's sort of satraps around said, you've got to do what he says. You've got to do what he says. You know the consequences. And Rokossovsky refused, and Stalin yielded because he knew that Rokossovsky could be trusted and was a great general.
Well, that was what
difference.
That was one of the things I learned from your book, and also we had Hugh Davey on last week talking about Stavka and how I think, from my perception, I mean, I'm not saying Stalin wasn't an autocratic, evil dictator, but there was actually far more collaboration and cooperation and discussion in the Soviet high command than perhaps my perception of it being, just Stalin doing exactly what he wants, which is exactly what's happening on the other side. It is very much Hitler says this is what happens, and and this comes back to this.
If you stood up to Hitler, to Hitler like Mannheim did, for instance, in the south, probably his greatest commander, he gets sacked. He didn't execute them. He sacked them. They turned them effectively into non-people. So it's true that there was much more to and fro, much more debate, and the generals, the staff was able to plan really very, very effectively against a Wehrmacht which was at sixes and sevens. Yeah. You have sort of craven figures immediately around Hitler. The commander of Army Group Center, which was defending Barbarossa, Butch, was a complete. I mean, very crudely, he was a completely feeble creep. He just did what he was told by Hitler, even when the evidence was compelling that his forces were being overrun. So in Barbarossa, for instance, to take one small example, the garrison there, was about 4,500 men, was overrun because they weren't allowed to leave and retreat until it was too late. They just took matters into their own hands. And only 50 of the 4,500 men survived to tell the tale. The rest were all killed. And just in obedience to Hitler's will. Hitler was almost saying we might, by the end of 44, was saying, yeah, we could lose the war, but we'll go down and we'll take the world down with us. So there was a sort of Gotterdammerung quality to Hitler's thinking then. It seems to me that it lacked all military rationale. There was just an ideological, perverted ideological sense that the Third Reich would either triumph or go up in flames.
Well, brilliantly put. And to bring things to an end, I've got one last question for you, really. It's about the general study of the Eastern Front and whether us Westerners are doing it enough. And, and it's been through some various sort of phases in the historiography over the 8 decades. Obviously during the Cold War, we were kind of playing down the Red Army and building up how proficient sometimes the Nazi commanders and vehicles and tanks were. Now in a different era with the terrible events in Ukraine. But if you want to study World War II, you obviously need to study the Eastern Front. But it seems to me, as you said yourself, it has much more as well to learn about the post-war era. Whereas again, perhaps looking at the battles of North Italy in 1944-45, the Western Front don't necessarily tell us much about the next phase. Is that you're still sticking with that idea, really?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think that people have been very kind in my book. I said, I've rewritten the history of it, but I haven't rewritten the history. I've added to the history. There's no such thing as rewriting history. I've added to the history. Now, the conclusions I draw about the victory of Stalin on the Eastern Front are on the basis of the evidence that I worked at for some time and put together in the form of this book. But the last part of the book seeks to take the story forward. When I say last part, it's only sort of 5,000-6,000 words. It's the last chapter really afterward. From 1944 to 2014, 80 years, because I think there is a link there. It's a very disconcerting and uncomfortable link, but it has to do with a combination of Russian feeling that they were great in the patriotic war, that they were a great empire. It didn't really matter whether it was emperors or empresses or Stalin, that Russia was a great nation and was humiliated by the end of the Cold War and the fall of all the dominoes of Eastern Europe collapsing, combined with the sort of fear that it could happen again when the West was a terrible threat. And so I try and trace that through, and I believe that can be traced back adequately to 1944, because 1944 was the year of a great Soviet triumph from the perspective of Moscow and the Russian people. It was a huge triumph. It was not only a great military victory against the Nazis, it was a huge political triumph against the capitalist adversaries or potential adversaries, who, of course, in the flush of victory, would all use warm words about one another, which essentially they barely meant.
Well, I couldn't, fantastic way to bring this to an end. And I think, you reference in the book, in the bibliography, the great works of people like David Glantz, who took us through all those campaigns to incredible detail, but maybe not always bringing in the kind of the wider geopolitical and sort of contextual understand that you've done. To take the subject as large as Bagration and open it up, and yet not dilute it too much with too much detail. You did a fantastic job. I, for one, haven't quite finished. I've got about a quarter to go, but I will get it finished this weekend.
You can get it. You can get it on audio as well, which for some people is a good way of doing it. You get driving somewhere, getting stuck in a traffic jam towards the sea.
I just can't. I can't do Kindles. Can't do ebooks. I have to have the physical book, and it has to really be a hardback. I'm a purist in that sense, but it's.
You're talking to a member of that club.
Yeah, well, we're dying out though, Jonthan. That's the thing. I mean, one of the things about doing this channel is there are whole swathes of my audience who don't buy books.
This elderly author is about to be 80 in 4 weeks' time.
Well.
And it's not a thing to be relished.
well, you've left us a fantastic legacy. Should you shuffle off this mortal coil, you've left us an incredible legacy. So, Jonthan, it's been absolutely delightful talking to you. It's an essential book, folks. I'll hold it up again. I know some of you in the sidebar have already read it, and thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me. And obviously, a busy day with what's going on in the UK, but it's been delightful talking to you. And folks, I will see you all again on Monday. We're back with more content next week. Click, like, and subscribe. Buy my guest books. But right now, this is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV saying, enjoy your weekend, everybody. Cheers. Bye.